Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. We are delighted to present here tonight the first two parts of the four-part television film Christ Stopped at Eboli by Francesco Rosi and based on the book by Carlo Levi. The reason why we are presenting these rarity, because as we will discover with Michael, it has just become available to the American public a few months ago, the entire version, the unedited version of the film, is of course the fact that we have upstairs, and I strongly encourage you to take a good look at it on your way out if you've not done it while you were coming to see the film, an exhibit of drawings by Carlo Levi. This is the first time that these drawings are seen outside of Italy. Many of you might know that Carlo Levi was a trained physician, even if he basically almost never practiced medicine, and he wanted to be a painter and an artist. That was his real vocation. As we will find out also from Michael, he found himself becoming a writer for the urgency of the things that he wanted to tell, given his experience at confino, in internal confinement. But deep inside, he always wanted to remain and be an artist. These drawings, 42 we have upstairs, from a group of 145, belong to the period in which Carlo Levi was in a clinic in Rome, undergoing surgery, eye surgery, retina detachment, that at that point was a very complicated surgery. It required almost immobility, and he was almost blind or had a very blurred vision for several months. But despite his physical condition, Levi wanted to draw every day. So the drawings that we have upstairs are a very moving testimony to his passion as artist, to the fact that he could not but draw every day, draw and write. The writings of Levi in this period have been published by Einaudi, his publisher, 2 years after his death, in a book called Quaderno a Cancelli, and the drawings are the ones that we have upstairs and the ones that remained in Italy. So take a look at those drawings. It's really a way for Carlo Levi to reflect on what he has inside. Since he couldn't see the outside, he's basically drawing and painting his memories. So there are portraits of his mother, self-portraits of the people he loved, symbolical paintings of animals that have symbolical meanings. So I think it's a perfect companion to what we're seeing tonight, that is the most visual of all experiences, that is cinema based on his novel. We have with us here tonight, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him back on the stage of Casa Italiana, Dr. Michael Moore, who has a PhD from New York University, and we're very proud to be his alma mater in Italian literature. He's an interpreter and a translator. He's one of the best interpreters you will ever hear. He's one that not only interprets from one language to the other, but he normally manages to make the person that interprets smarter than it is. That's my impression. Yeah, I would be delighted if Michael could always translate me, because I know I would sound much better. And as a literary translator, and I would say that's your real passion, Michael is working on a monumental enterprise right now, that is the translation of Alessandro Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, really a monumental task, the fundamental novel in all of Italian literature, but is also translated contemporary writers, Genovesi, Veronesi, Calabresi, but it didn't happen on purpose that you translated, but also Starnone and Henri De Luca, and we had the pleasure of Nicola Gardini, and we had the pleasure of having Michael here other times to talk about his work as a literary translator. He's also very involved in pen and in really fostering the idea of literary translation. So he's the practitioner of translation, but he's also a theorist of translation. He teaches translation. So we are delighted that he's here with us. The reason is that when Rialto Pictures decided to take this film and release it, so restore it and release it for the American audience, there was the need of subtitles. And they, of course, asked Michael to proceed with this. So that's the reason why we have him here with us. And I would like to ask him to tell us something about this experience of delving in such a deep way into Carlo Levi's book and in the film based on his book.
Thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I can only repay your compliments by saying, you know, the presence of so many people here tonight on a Friday night is really a testament to the wonderful work that you've done here over the years in the Casa Italiana in fostering a love for Italian culture and in recognizing how much all of us want to read Italian books, see Italian films, and go sort of beyond the sort of pizza pasta connection, you know, of Italy. I don't know when all of you were first, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the book. My own experience was before I went to Italy the first time in I was going to say 85, but I would be lying, in 1975, my old high school teacher, who was Italian, and many of the Italian-American teachers that we had in my school system in Massachusetts were people of culture. They taught music, they taught art, they taught literature, you know, anything but the image that we see coming out of Hollywood so often. And he said, oh, you should really read this book before you go to Italy. And I read it and I was completely charmed. It didn't really prepare me for Milano of the 1970s, but I was very struck by, you know, the magic, you know, by the sort of belief in spirits and sweeping in front of the door and the fairies that would come in and spells and filters. And it was the first book that I read in Italian. I can still remember the cover of the edition that I had, and it was very accessible to me. I was really proud that I could read in Italian at that point. So when I was asked to do the subtitles for the film these many years later, I was very, first of all, I reread it in Italian, and it was a completely new experience. First, I was struck at how beautifully written it was, how beautiful his Italian is, and how the fact that Carlo Levi, a painter, tried to capture in words this landscape that he spent a good I think it was not maybe entirely 2 years, but a 2-year period trying to capture in color, he was trying to capture in words. And so I was amazed by the language, by the story that he was telling, particularly today about immigration, because he's talking about how these people in this, you know, in this part of Italy, Basilicata, but in the fascist period it was called Lucania, and how it was a very impoverished area, and poverty forced a lot of migration. And unlike this image that people have of immigration being one way, it was constantly a two-way street. People were going and coming. And they lament in this, at one scene that you'll see, they'll say, ci siamo stati fregati 2 volte, we were robbed, or we were cheated twice, you know, by sort of being lured back to this impoverished area by promises of the fascists that everything is going great, you know, it's not like you hear. So even though they couldn't really make conditions better for everyone, they could certainly issue their propaganda over the radio about how fascism was making everything greater, if we can use that adjective today. And then twice, because then they might, you know, and then twice, of course, because they would meet a girl, fall in love, marry, buy a plot of land, and then sort of find themselves kind of stuck in this impoverished place with nothing left of America except maybe some old records. So I was very struck by the side of immigration and then, of course, by the analysis of the Mezzogiorno of the South. Now, going from that to putting it into subtitles, you know, you're sort of taking, everything has to be shrunk into the smallest possible place because the idea is that you should be looking at the screen. Bruce Goldstein of the Film Forum, who commissioned this from me, has a wonderful presentation where he shows you what would happen if every word were translated and the entire screen is covered. And what we want you to be doing is to be looking at what happened. looking at the various languages of the film and not only at the spoken language. The challenge here was partly a dialect, and I have no pretension to knowing Southern dialect, not just because I was in the North. I had many Southern friends. I can pick up things here and there, but there are certain moments that are difficult, and if any of you can tell what was happening then, please give me notes later. But we made a decision. There is a real divide here. On the one, you have the narrator, and the way they made, just in terms of the way that Francesco Rosi, who I had the privilege of knowing, the filmmaker, decided to work, was there's an eternal question in filmmaking. Is it possible to film autobiography? How can you show film from only one point of view? Here is a memoir that's being adopted. How do we represent this as a memoir, as one man's point of view? And his solution is to have the main character, Gian Maria Volonté, a wonderful actor, and normally very expressive, very stoic in this film, because he is observing everything that's happening around him. So you, as the, not to tell you how to see the film, but I think in order to enter into the film, you have to place yourself in his shoes. And he is a man from the North who, because of his political activities, has been sentenced to internal exile, they called confino, in this impoverished Italian village. And he doesn't understand the local dialect. And so we made the decision, and sometimes you'll see people subtitling everything, including songs, etc. And I said, no. And a normal Italian viewer is not going to be able to understand what's going on. He doesn't understand what's going on, so we're not going to give this, gift to the American viewer and pretend that they're supposed to understand something that even the narrator himself is unable to understand. So we wanted to keep it very minimal, both for the reasons of you watching the film, but also in truth to the experience of the narrator.
And Michael, and this impossibility for the protagonist to understand the language that the people around him speak, it's also for a while the impossibility for him to understand everything that comes with this culture, with their traditions, their superstitions, their beliefs, call them as you were, as you wish. And I wanted to ask you something about the words. I know that in the presentation at Film Forum, you underlined a few key words that our audience might want to pay attention to because they're recurrent and they're very peculiar. Do you want to tell us some of those words?
Of just some context, because we introduced the film at the Film Forum just to help people understand certain things that might not be clear even after seeing the film. There's several contexts. There is a historical context where there's constant reference to unification of Italy, and to Piedmont, where he is from. So he's from northern Italy, he's in southern Italy. So they're always going back to 1860, into that moment when Piedmont, the Kingdom of Sardinia, it was called, sort of took over this area and drove out the Bourbons. And you're going to hear about the bourbon, not the whiskey, but the Spanish, the Spanish branch of the French family ruled from Naples, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, another strangely named kingdom, and were driven out. So you'll hear a kind of a wistfulness about what life was like under the Bourbon, under the Bourbons. You'll hear about Piedmont, and you'll hear about the Royal Army, which is referring to the army of the unified Italy, to which these people do not feel that they belong. But you hear a lot of talk about brigands, and I had to really fight, actually, with people at Film Forum to keep in the word brigand. They wanted to say bandit. But the brigands were a kind of guerrilla movement objecting to, some of them were financed by the Bourbons, like hoping that maybe by sort of disrupting...
Led by a cardinal. Cardinal Ruffo di Calabria was the head of the dragon that fought against the unification of Italy.
So there was definitely a sort of a movement of insurrection. So they weren't just, highway robbers or anything like that. So that was one of the words that we insisted on. A lot of words that are typical of fascism, so you're going to find reference to the Ventennio, the 20 years. Faccetta Nera, there are these anthems that come up. Faccetta Nera, Little Black Face, because this is also taking place during Italy's attempt to sort of recreate a Roman Empire by conquering Ethiopia, committing horrible war crimes that I think Italy has still not accounted for today. Its use of mustard gas to slaughter innocent civilians. So you're going to hear talk of Ethiopia. You're going to hear Giovinezza also, another anthem. You hear these are like marching songs of fascism. So I think those were some of the key terms that sort of come to mind.
Wonderful. Is there any question that you might have for Michael that we have the fortune of having here with us tonight? No? I think we are ready to start our marathon. I remind you that we are going to see the next two parts of the film, so part 3 and part 4, Monday evening. And with us, we're going to have Professor Stanislao Pugliese that will concentrate more on the historical and political elements of the film. Enjoy the film, and thank you again very much to Michael Moore for being here with us tonight. Thank you. Signore e signori, buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò for this screening of the last two parts of Christ Stopped at Eboli, a film by Francesco Rosi, based on the book by Carlo Levi. It's a great pleasure to see that our auditorium is still full and there are also people in the library. So we're very excited about your response to our invitation. Before I introduce formally my guests for tonight, I just want to remind you that the reason why we're having this special screening of this film that has just been digitally restored and newly subtitled by Rialto Pictures, and that had a very successful run this past spring at Film Forum, is the exhibit that we have upstairs. How many of you have seen the exhibit? Bravi. Bravi. I'm happy when you do your homework. But for those of you who have not had a chance to see it, please stop by on your way out or anytime you want until December 13th. This is a series of drawings. There are 42 out of the entire body of 145 drawings that Carlo Levi produced during a time of his life, very difficult time. He was in a clinic. He was undergoing eye surgery for a retina detachment. And even if he could barely see, he wanted to continue to draw. As many of you know, Carlo Levi was a trained physician, even if he almost never practiced, became a writer because of the circumstances in which he found himself, that are the ones at the center of the film. But really what he wanted to be was an artist, and he was. And even in those moments of extreme difficulty, he was able to draw and to produce drawings. And we're very, very fortunate to have these drawings here upstairs. It's the first time that these drawings travel outside of Italy. So please take some time to see them on your way out. And before I told you that I would introduce you, Stanislao Pugliese, who is a professor of history at Hofstra University. He's the Queensborough Unico Distinguished Professor of Italian-American Studies. He was a research fellow in a variety of very, very distinguished places. I'm not going to read all of his biography. I just want you to know that he's a specialist on modern and contemporary Italy, on the anti-fascist resistance, Italian Jews. He wrote books ranging from Carlo Levi, Carlo Rosselli, Ignazio Silone, and many, many others. He's the perfect person to be here with us tonight, and after we heard Michael Moore to talk about the literary and linguistic aspects of the novel Christ Stopped at Eboli, we couldn't have somebody more fitting than Professor Pugliese to talk about history and politics surrounding Carlo Levi. Please welcome Stanislao Pugliese.
Thank you, Stefano. So, just out of curiosity, how many people were here Friday evening? Oh, wow, everybody came back. Very good. I apologize, I couldn't be here, but I have to tell you, it's really an extraordinary honor, actually, to talk about Carlo Levi, because I think he is one of the fundamental thinkers and writers of 20th century Italy, and was part of a tradition that I argue, unfortunately, is not as well known in Italy as it should be. There is probably in every large Italian city, and even not so large city, there's a Piazza Fratelli Rosselli or something named after Carlo Levi or Primo Levi or any one of the other people from the movement of Giustizia e Libertà, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But that kind of political and cultural and intellectual tradition, I think, was lost for certain reasons that we might get into. But let me begin at the beginning. You know, how many of you know about this movement, Giustizia e Libertà, which was created in 1929? You probably know Bernardo Bertolucci's film, The Conformist, which won the Academy Award in 1972, I think. But that was based on a novel by Alberto Moravia. The Professor Quadri, who was assassinated in Paris by the conformist, by the fascist protagonist, was based on Carlo Rosselli. Carlo Rosselli came from a very distinguished patriotic family. Mazzini had died in a relative's house. And in 1929, he, Emilio Lussu, Alberto Tarchiani, and others created this movement. Rosselli and others were very particular about this. This was going to be a movement. It was not going to be a political party. Embedded in the ideology of Giustizia e Libertà was a critique of politics and of political parties that you will hear and see in the film. There are very critical scenes in the book which were not included in the theatrical release in America in 1980. I saw when I was, a college student. But they're absolutely critical. The conversation at the end that he has with his sister, the conversation that he has at the end with the intellectuals after he is released from Confino. Giustizia e Libertà had managed to carve itself some space on the political spectrum between the Italian Communist Party and the Italian Socialist Party. And it was based on Carlo Rosselli's idea of a liberal socialism, which at that time seemed to be a kind of paradox or oxymoron. But Rosselli argued, as did people like Carlo Levi and later on Primo Levi and Manuel Artom and others, Leone Ginsberg, some famous names, Piero and Ado Gobetti, who were sort of like forerunners of Giustizia e Libertà in Torino, the idea that liberalism and socialism were not antithetical, as is oftentimes thought, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, where liberalism was coming out of this 18th and 19th century idea of classical liberalism, freedom of speech and all of that, and socialism, which was supposedly antithetical to that. Rosselli and the others argued that you could not have liberalism unless you had socialism in the 20th century. And so he made this critique that attracted a lot of intellectuals on the left and a lot of Jewish intellectuals. At one point, I was working on both Carlo Levi and Primo Levi, and my daughter reminded me every morning, Dad, Carlo Levi, Primo Levi, keep your Levi straight. But the reason why is because, when I was in graduate school, someone told me to do my dissertation on fascism, and I was like, I don't want to spend the next 10 years of my life thinking about these people. So I had gravitated towards anti-fascism. My first work was on Giustizia e Libertà, and out of that came the book on Carlo Rosselli. But I find these people, these men and women, extraordinarily not only brave, but having a kind of very, I think, brilliant critique of Italian society at the beginning of the 20th century, the conformity of Italian society, the conservatism of Italian society, even the conservatism of the Italian Communist Party, and that's saying something. There was a time when the members of Giustizia e Libertà took it upon themselves to go to Spain in defense of the Spanish Republic, even before the Italian Communist Party gave the official word. Of course, they were waiting, from Russia to have the official word to go participate and defend the Spanish Republic. Carlo Levi himself was a kind of figure unto himself, sui generis, He was attracted to all of the avant-garde artists in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. He wrote this extraordinarily profound book that was really not well received. It had come out in Italy after Christ Stopped at Eboli, and when it came out, also published by Einaudi, people were saying, is this the same Carlo Levi who wrote Cristo si è fermato a Eboli?
And Stan, that's the American version. You translated it and edited it, right?
I didn't translate it because when I proposed the translation, I realized that the translation that had been done by Farrar Straus in 1950 was better than I had done. So what I proposed was a new edition of that translation with an introduction that I wrote. But one of the reasons that I insisted on publishing this book is because when it was translated into English in 1950, the same year it was published in Italy, the title in English was Fear and Freedom. But the original title was Paura della Libertà, Fear of Freedom, which is a very different critique, right? And I talk about that in the introduction. And this edition, which was published by Columbia University Press a few years ago, has my translation of an essay which should be read in conjunction with the exhibit upstairs, Paura della pittura. And what Carlo Levi had done, he wrote this book in 1939 before he wrote Christ Stopped at Eboli, because, you know, that was written afterwards. It was as war clouds were gathering. This was February and March, the spring of 1939, when it was obvious that war was happening. And Levi had this incredible insight, which he boiled down to what he called the eternal tendency towards fascism, which was picked up by people like Carlo Rosselli and Primo Levi, who in an op-ed, an essay for the Corriere della Sera in 1974, wrote that every age has its own fascism. An extraordinary essay, you can find it in English as well, but Primo Levi, had written that you don't need black shirts in the streets or, you know, people with swastikas on their sleeve to have fascism. You need the manipulation of the media. You need the manipulation of education. You need the manipulation of social media, you know. And these insights, which had been floating around in the movement of Giustizia e Libertà in the 1930s and 1940s, had a kind of post-war resurrection, if you will, with the Partito d'Azione, which also petered out after the war, because the Partito d'Azione, inheriting the idea of being a movement and not a political party, had a kind of amorphous political ideology, again, trying to carve itself out some space on the political spectrum between the Italian Communist Party and the Italian Socialist Party. And it was not viable in post-war Italy. And when that party, the Partito d'Azione, dissolved in 1945, 1946, most of the intellectuals gravitated towards the other political parties on the left. But these are people that you know, like Ferruccio Pari, who became the first prime minister of post-war Italy. People like Sandro Pertini, who became the president of Italy. People like even, let's say, Spadolini, who was, you know, before he joined the Italian Republican Party, was vaguely, loosely associated with the Partito d'Azione.
And even President Ciampi, former president of the Republic, he also came from that tradition. He was very young when the Partito d'Azione was sort of dissolved, but he definitely always made reference to that as a sort of ideal compass.
Right, and there are these smaller political groups that exist today, and probably the person that I know best is a dear friend of mine, Valdo Spini, who was the son of Giorgio Spini, who was a member of the resistance. Valdo Spini is probably the only politician from the Italian Socialist Party who was not caught up in Mani Puliti, maybe because he's a Valdensian and not well, that's a whole nother story. But Valdo Spini in Florence, who is the president of the Cercolo Fratelli Rosselli, tries to keep up this tradition of Giustizia e Libertà and intellectuals like Carlo Levi and Primo Levi. The film is really extraordinary. As I said before, it includes scenes that had been cut from the theatrical release. They are very important in the book, and we are very grateful to have them restored into the original edition. So, any other questions, Stefano?
Yeah, I would like to see if any people in the audience, you've already seen half of these TV marathon. That's how it was conceived, actually. It was 4 episodes of 1 hour each, broadcasted in 4 different nights. That's at the time in which Rai Television really had the role of producing cinema of very high level. Think of people like Ermanno Olmi or the Taviani brothers or Francesco Rosi. Most of the films that they made in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s were actually produced by Italian television, the public television system. That has undeniably a great merit, because if you go to somebody and tell them, a producer, I have this 4-hour film about a sort of a memoir of somebody that goes in the South. It's all going to be shot in dialect. Nobody's going to understand it. And it's about poverty and an anti-fascist dealing with. Which producer would ever say yes to that? And so Rai at that time really had this very strong pedagogical tension. They wanted to teach. They wanted to be a venue through which Italians became more in touch with their culture and with their history. So for this also we have to be grateful. And there is, again, these group of authors that really made films basically thanks to Rai Television. So any question you might have? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Maybe that's why it's, what you just explained is why I thought the fidelity of the first 2 hours to the book was
really marvelous, and the sense of, I mean, there was not an important scene from the book, at least in the first half, I guess, or so of the book, that was missing from the film, and I guess with 4 hours maybe you could do it, but it was very thrilling to see it realized in as rich and as full a way as it was.
Absolutely. I taught this book and the adaptation in my cinema and literature class. And when we see in class the American version that was about an hour and a half out of the 4 hours, the students went wild saying, oh, they didn't put that, and they didn't put that, and that is missing, and that is changed. If they saw these, I think they would have a little less to say in terms of the differences. Yeah, it's of course with 4 hours you have more time, and I think more than the time per se and presenting every single episode described in the book, you're really able to give a sense of the pace, of the time for the people living in this context. Very much like in Tree of the Wooden Clogs that some of you have seen here by the great Ermanno Olmi, where it seems, I always say it's like time like slows down and it makes you slow down, because that's the time paced by the rhythm and rituals of an agricultural family, a rural family in the north of Italy at the beginning of the century, where time is not given by clocks or phones, but by the seasons and by the sun. So when a director is able to slow you down in that way and to impose the pace of nature on you, I think it's a great result. And I think in the 4 hours, you also have the sense of time slowing down. And what might have been also the experience of Carlo Levi, going from an industrial, very lively cultural city like Turin was, finding himself in this situation where time literally stood still. Yes, Stan, and then, yes.
I know the book was quite a success all over Europe. What was the response to the film so many years after the book was published?
The book was a great success, as we heard also from Michael Moore on Friday in the States as well. It was published just 2 years after it came out in Italy. As Stan has mentioned, the book was actually written after the experience. He took notes while he was in Confino, but the book was physically written in Florence. Actually, if you are in front of Palazzo Pitti in Florence, you see there is a marble plaque that says, here Carlo Levi wrote Christ stopped at Eboli. So facing Palazzo Pitti in Florence, not while he was actually
While the Germans were trying to find him to kill him.
Yeah, and he was in hiding right there in that place. Yeah, and the response, and the book was published 2 years later. Basically, it's the book that made Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, because it was the first international success that they published. I'm not aware of the responses of the audience or of critics to the American version of the film, I have to say. I don't know what the reactions were. I know that in Italy it was a huge event when it was shown on television. Basically, everybody would watch it. You would talk about it in school. It was really the topic of discussion. It was expected. People were waiting for it. And when it happened, there was a lot of expectation, and it was very well received. I mean, it's one of the many films that build up Francesco Rosi's career as this director, incredibly interested in social and political issues.
I think that Vincent Canby wrote a review in the New York Times when it came out here. You can see that online.
Yes, and then back there.
From a historical point of view, perhaps political point of view, after the book came out and it was read, say, north, did it have an impact in Rome in terms of bringing Cristo to the south?
It's a great question.
It had a double effect. The film and the book had a double effect in the sense that it brought, again, to the forefront of Italian discussion, debate, the Southern question, you know, this eternal question, like, even the way it's framed is very revealing. Like, why is the South always lagging behind? Why is the South always corrupt? Why can't the South catch up to the North? You know, which had already been asked in the 19th century. It had been a very important part of the Risorgimento and the post-Risorgimento movement, you know. It had its roots in the early part of the 19th century, but then it was resurrected with this book, you know, the experience of an urban northern intellectual to have this kind of epiphany, and I use that language from religion very specifically, this kind of revelation of this kind of peasant civilization that had been completely unknown. But it also raised the question, and this is a question that I ask my students, what is it in that culture of the Mezzogiorno that allowed those people to go to Torino or to Rome or wherever, or to America, or Argentina, or Australia, and actually succeed? Now, I don't want to paint a picture that every single immigrant who left, the port of Naples and Palermo became successful. You see this like in Stanley Tucci's film Big Night, where failure is actually also important. But like, what was it in that culture? And Carlo Levi approached that culture with respect. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, when Carlo Levi died in 1975, he requested to be buried in Aliano. That's where his tomb is, in Aliano. So, this extraordinary kind of opening to the rest of Italy, a kind of culture that had been either neglected or denigrated for decades.
The book was published in Italy in 1945, 46, and it definitely is at the center, one of the roots of the new meridionalismo, the bringing the Southern question back into the discussion in Parliament. It was a very heated moment from a political point of view, where Christian Democrats and basically the Communist Socialist coalition confronted each other. The film took a few decades to be made. It comes out in 1979. It's right in the middle of the so-called years of the gun, gli anni di piombo. Political terrorism is at its height. Aldo Moro was kidnapped and killed, the president of the major party, in the middle of Rome in 1978. So many things have changed in the meantime. And I don't think in 1979 the terms of the Southern question or meridionalismo were still, the problems were still there, but it didn't become an issue anymore. Yeah.
A kind of interesting publishing note that you might find interesting, that the very moment that Cristo si è fermato a Eboli is being published by Einaudi, the most prestigious literary publishing house in Italy, in Torino, they were rejecting Primo Levi's manuscript for Se questo è un uomo. So this is kind of interesting, because Carlo Levi was sort of plugged into that kind of intellectual elite of Torino, whereas Primo Levi wasn't. And he had sent his manuscript to Natalia Ginsburg, the widow of Leone Ginsburg, who was a member of Giustizia e Libertà, killed by the Gestapo in Rome in 1944. This kind of odd, two ships passing in the night, one ending up being published and one being published by a very small press, Da Silva, and then only picked up by Einaudi like 10 years later.
Yep.
It's kind of, but yeah.
Back there, yes.
Dr. Albertini, as I reflect on the first 2 hours, I've been thinking that this film achieved a remarkable depth of intellectual and emotional integrity, which is very hard to do in film with so little dialogue. It's what filmmakers say, if you can achieve it, the smallest amount of dialogue is the most desirable. And I think it's a great example of that rule.
I totally agree. And here is, everything is even emphasized by the fact that the dialogue is between people that don't really speak the same language. You hear a lot of the local dialect of Agliano, but you also hear a lot of Levi speaking in Torinese dialect in the first 2 hours of the film. That is not something I remember from the book. The book, Levi is the narrating voice. There is not much Torino dialect. Whereas I think Rosi really wanted to emphasize that. And that's why the dialogue is like boiled down to a minimum. And it's a film that speaks a lot with the images, with the photography. Because of this impossibility to communicate using a common language. Italian is definitely not a common language for these people.
And yet this level of understanding seems to be very...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I would add, just on this note, that it's a painterly film. That its slowness, its richness is derived from the fact that I think Rosi was sensitive to the fact that, Carlo Levi was a painter in words, and here painting an image, like, taking its time to develop. In an age when we are bombarded with images, 50 images in a 30-second commercial, this is a film that gives you the luxury and also the imperative to think. And that, I think, is really a gift that the author and the director have given us.
One more question? Yes?
The gentleman saying the texture of that film, I felt the same thing in Gatto Parco, the same sort of visual
the punishment. And maybe we can add something about confino or internal confinement. Basically, it was a sort of exile, but instead of being sent abroad, where you could have enjoyed a certain deal of freedom to communicate with other members of your group, or with other political factions, or with the foreign power in which you found yourself. And that's the case, for example, of Don Sturzo, was the founder of the Italian Popular Party. He was sent to New York. Once he was in New York, he continued his anti-fascist battle from New York. In order to avoid that, they had internal confinement. That meant you were sent to a small town or island or village, normally in central or southern Italy, where your first and main punishment would be to be completely isolated from the rest of the world. You couldn't receive any correspondence. If you received letters, they had to be read before and reported to the central police officer. And as you saw in the film, also the confinanti, if there was more than one person that was experiencing confinement in a town, they couldn't communicate among each other. At least in this specific situation. And the interesting thing, it was not the result of a judicial procedure. So you didn't need to go to trial. You know that fascism, among many other horrible things, instituted a special tribunal for the defense of the state that could condemn people to any kind of penalty, including the death penalty. Gramsci, for example, was condemned to prison by the Tribunale Speciale, by the Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State. Confino did not need a trial, did not need a judge to pronounce you guilty of something. It could be the result of una soffiata, of somebody that informed the authorities that you were politically active, and it was enough that the prefect, it was the local police authority in every province, decided that you constituted a danger for the political welfare of the country. And he would write the provvedimento, the decision, his decree, but without going to trial. So that's what is something that we need to remember about confino. You did not need to be condemned by a judge with a jury and lawyers. It could be a completely administrative procedure initiated anonymously by somebody, and then that was followed through by the police, and the prefect could decide for how long you would stay and the accessory measures that would be imposed on you. Well, at this point, he was not looked for any other reason than for being an anti-fascist. And this is before the racial laws and before the deportation of Italian Jews. We're talking about 35, 36, the events that happened in the film. If you hear references to the African War, when Italians conquer Ethiopia, that's exactly when it's taking place, the film. So it's about 2 to 3 years that Carlo Levi is confined in Agliano.
Very briefly, Levi finds himself in confino because the cell in Torino of Giustizia e Libertà was betrayed by a police informant. The movement, for whatever reason, was very susceptible to police spies. In fact, they had been in Paris and they had followed the movement very closely. They were in Torino, they were in Rome, they were in Florence. At one point, some police spy in Paris sends a telegram back to Rome saying that the anti-fascists are talking about Carlo Rosselli as a possible leader of Italy after Mussolini. When Mussolini heard that, he gave the order for the Rosselli brothers to be assassinated. Italy has a long tradition of prison writings, Gramsci being only the most famous, but it also has a long tradition of writings from Confino, and the other people being like Cesare Pavese, who was in Brancaleone in Calabria, and others too. There's this whole tradition of, writing from Confino.
Yes, last question, sir.
When one was in Confino, was there any option for escape? Or was it you were in any danger of getting more repercussions?
Have you driven to Matera? If you've been to Agliano, well, no, the idea, like Stefano said, is this isolation. The problem was there was a realization that prison was actually an incubator of radical ideas. The irony with Gramsci is the prosecutor said, we have to keep this mind from working for the next 20 years. And the irony is that if Gramsci wasn't in prison, we would not have the prison notebooks. But no, I don't think escape was an option. You'll see that Levi has to sign in every day, and so that was not an option.
No, again, they were chosen for being particularly isolated or small islands, like Ponza, for example, where for a series of coincidences, you have basically the founders of the idea of a unified Europe that are all there at the same time at Confino. No chance to escape from Ponza, and very difficult to escape from here. And since it was considered all in all rather lenient compared to what happened to other anti-fascists, they would brave the weather, stay there, write, do research, and then go back to the
having said that, I just remember my first book. Carlo Rosselli actually did escape from Lipari in something like a Hollywood scene. They bought a boat from some prince in Egypt. They sailed out into the middle of the Mediterranean off the shores of Lipari. Carlo Rosselli, Emilio Lesu, and one other person, they literally swam under the noses of the fascist police. They jumped on the motorboat and they made their way to Tunisia, from Tunisia to Marseille to France, to Paris. It was one of the only escapes from Confino, and it was something that electrified Italy and electrified Europe, because one of the big things about Giustizia e Libertà was the stress on action. So, for example, they sponsored Bassanesi's flight over Milan, where he dropped the leaflets out against fascism. They went to Spain in defense of the Spanish Republic. They were plotting assassination attempts against Mussolini. They were doing all of these actions, including, propaganda and graffiti on the walls of Italian cities. So there was this idea that the grand gesture would spark an uprising. It was a very romantic 19th century idea, right? That the gesture would spark an uprising among the Italian people, and that's why they went to Spain. From Spain, Carlo Rosselli on the radio gave a famous speech, Oggi in Spagna, domani in Italia, which echoed like the Jewish prayer at Passover. But the idea today, anti-fascist, and this was Giustizia e Libertà's ideology, the Spanish Civil War is not a Spanish Civil War. It is a European Civil War. It is a European ideological war of the left against fascism. And that was the time to stop fascism there in Spain. And they really, even the Soviet Union did not buy that argument.
I think it's all the time we have. You have an hour and 50 minutes, the two episodes. As you might remember from Friday, there are going to be credits at the end of the third episode. That is going to be the first one you see tonight. But stay here or go to the bathroom if you want to, and then come back, because immediately after the end titles are over, the fourth and last episode of the film is going to begin. Thank you again to Professor Stan Pugliese for having been here with us, and thanks to all of you.